So as I've sat and listened to presentations over the last 2 days, I think I've had less and less new stuff to say. So I think some of this is probably going to be a repeat. Maybe it's just a reinforcement or sum up of some of the key themes. And also just to talk a little bit about what we as South Africans, where we participate, how we operate in the industry, where our key areas of involvement and focus are relative to an Asian and a Chinese involvement and kind of participation. So this is a slide from an amazing woman in PGM called Marjorie Ryan, who works at Johnson Matthey. And I think it's great. It's simple. It basically shows the PGM ecosystem. And I think you, as someone in this room, should be able to look at it and know where you fit. But you can also understand very quickly how it connects you into this global ecosystem. And if you look at some of the values and the vision that Wilma has used to kind of found women in PGMs, I think they're actually values that are common across our industry in terms of how we collaborate, in terms of how we support each other, and in terms of what we do and the importance that it kind of holds for our countries, our companies, and the globe. So obviously, from a South African perspective, we are very, very much focused on supply. And as I said yesterday, that supply comes with a huge amount of responsibility, a huge number of skills, a huge range of roles and positions, and there are women and men across all of these. So it's a very diversified set of skills that come together to produce PGMs. But love a bar chart, and we're the biggest bar. So Southern Africa, because South African companies are very integral to mining in both Zimbabwe and South Africa, dominates primary supply. So the numbers, about 64% of global supply from, and I went over these numbers about 6 or 7 times, but there are some variations, so we've done some rounding, a bit of poetic license. According to the Minerals Council, 175,000 employees in PGM mining in South Africa. 18% of those are women, but 22% of senior management in PGM companies are also women. We contribute about 14% of export earnings to the country, and we generate about 2.3% of GDP. Unfortunately, these were 2024 numbers. I can tell you that that number's been a lot higher at various points over the recent past. This is a difficult slide, sorry, and it isn't translated, but this for us sums up some of the areas in which we as a business operate and what we consider. And we call it our operating context. Where do South African producers have activities and responsibilities? So I think the first is to our customers, and it encapsulates what we do for the market, how we produce our metal, the level of integrity with which we approach environmental matters, the nature of our relationships, and the nature in which we support and develop the market. We need a strong future market to be able to continue to invest and produce our metals. So the customer and the market and the environmental and kind of social and governance issues around that is an absolute key element of the South African operating context. Another key responsibility, particularly in the context of South Africa, is to our employees. How we treat them, how we train them, how we remunerate them, and how we protect them to ensure that they are able to improve the lives of their families. And I think this is particularly true in the context of South Africa, where unemployment is incredibly high. So there's a very significant responsibility to employers because of where we operate and because of the nature of our work and the potential for harm. I think the third aspect is the government. It's a tricky situation. As I said yesterday, by the time we have refined an ounce of platinum, we have created significant value. And we are very conscious that though we are a dominant producer of metal, we are not a dominant consumer of metal. And we have to find a middle ground in terms of creating and sharing value. We have to be able to give an opportunity for our global network to be able to create value for their economies, their employees, their customers through the use of our product. And we need to balance that with the perception of being an exporter of raw materials. Union leadership, again, I think the concept of organised labour, the extent to which that impacts on how we operate, how we deal with people, how we engage with employees, is quite a South African, it's quite South African centric. I think the good news is that, you know, for the first kind of decade of my career, questions on South Africa were very much about labour relationships and union relationships. And I think very pleasingly, there's been a huge maturation in the nature of those relationships. I think the industry has come a huge way in terms of how we share value, employee participation and profits, the level of compensation offered, the nature of compensation in terms of benefits, including housing and medical and education. But I do think it is a stakeholder that needs to be balanced. Then I think no, I can't see in my green, sorry, pardon. The other aspect, as I said, in the context of South Africa, is to our host communities. Mining matters. Each miner in South Africa supports up to 10 dependents. And not only do we support communities through employment, but we also, in many respects, fill the gaps of where government sometimes struggles to deliver in terms of basic services. So if you look at the socio-economic impact of what mining operations in South Africa do, the numbers are staggering. In 2024, over 16,500 students and over 500 teachers were supported and nurtured essentially by the big PGM producing countries. So massive investment in education, massive investment in health and basic services. In terms of the regulators, I think I've covered that a little bit in terms of government. And then the final aspect, I think, which is important, is balancing all of that with the needs of our shareholders. I mean, we are businesses, we operate for profit, we operate to be able to create value and share that value. And I think that South African context sometimes does create conflict in terms of managing all of that. I think if you look at these key pillars, though, of that operation context, you can understand the diversity of skills and experience that people operating in our industry have in terms of what they deal with on a day-to-day basis, what their exposure is. But it's quite South African-centric. There's a limited opportunity to understand all of this. And I think that's one of the big opportunities of Women in PGMs, is essentially it's enabling the people who maybe work on social and labour plans or who work on environmental management to understand who they are, what we do, and how the world uses our metals and what we contribute to the global context. This is a busy chart, but I can't put up my margin chart. Okay, but I've got to swap the slide. No, there you go. Sorry. I think you've heard from a number of people that we don't just produce one metal, we produce a basket of metals with individual market fundamentals at various points. And that price cyclicality is a headache. It's something that needs to be managed and planned for. And we have to balance the long-term nature of markets, the long-term nature of investment with some very short-term volatility. And that, again, I think it creates uncertainty and I think it creates complexity. So the chart on the left-hand side is that basket over time, and the chart on the right-hand side is essentially operating margins. And you can see the extent to which margins move. And as I said to Wade yesterday, uncertainty, and I think it creates complexity. So the chart on the left-hand side is that basket over time, and the chart on the right-hand side is essentially operating margins. And you can see the extent to which margins move. And as I said to Wade yesterday, rounding, so please don't check these numbers, just trust me on the ballpark. So very simply, PGMs are used across a couple of big buckets. We think about the consumer, we think about industrial, and we think about auto. There's obviously, in consumer, there's investment, there's jewelry, industrial, masses of applications, cars, everyone loves to count a car. And you can see that even today, China is an absolutely massive contributor to demand from each of those three major metals. If we look at demand over time, and again this talks to the longer term picture, is PGM demand has evolved and shifted and been driven by big societal themes for 50 years. And I know it's 50 because the JM drought started in 1975 and my sister's turning 50. But there have been a couple of key elements that have driven big changes in demand. And I think you're going to continue to see that. And I think at every step of the way, the size and the scale of China, the nature of its consumer, the nature of its consumption, the nature of its societal goals is going to be a key component of the way in which future markets develop. So just to kind of come full circle, Vilma talked about those key kind of guiding principles of the network. For me, they are the guiding principles of our industry, of how we operate and how we deal with each other. I think the ability to show South African women and kind of share knowledge of actually men as well. I mean, Vilma talked about the mentoring program. I know that there were two incredibly senior, long-serving male members of the industry who've been part of that mentoring program. I don't think their mentees understood just how lucky they were in terms of who they were speaking to on the other side of the line. But it is a mechanism to increase understanding. It's to increase the opportunity to share and to learn and to understand the purpose of being involved in an industry that creates very, very special metals for very special people.